Hi. Okay, so I'm going to briefly introduce and then explain the results from a project that we ran this summer, supported by the BH Bulletin grant, that was focused on developing accessible methods for monitoring biodiversity in the urban environment. So a quick introduction. So why do we want biodiversity in our cities? So urban environments are now acting as refuges for quite a lot of species that are no longer able to persist in the rural environments due to agricultural intensification. They also have, biodiversity also has associated ecosystem services which have an economic and human well-being value to urban inhabitants, and supporting the ecosystem services in cities reduces urban reliance on ecosystems outside of the city. There's also growing bodies of evidence between links of human health and biodiversity, which I think the next speaker might go into a little bit, that as humans we intrinsically need biodiversity both for our health and our well-being. So our project was focused on helping people retrofit green spaces and biodiverse green spaces in particular onto the grey structures of the city. So you might recognise the High Line structure in New York, which is a very famous piece of green infrastructure, which took an old train line and transformed it into a space for people to use in the city. Also, here on the right, this is a massive green wall which has just gone up in Victoria in London on the Rubens building. And if anyone wants to see an example of an area of London that is successfully managing to green itself and add biodiverse features to it, I would suggest Victoria is a great example of where this is happening. But how well are we doing? One issue with retrofitting these green features onto buildings is that those people that are involved in maintaining them afterwards aren't usually equipped with the ecological expertise to be able to monitor how well these features are doing for biodiversity. And this is an example of a failed green roof in Islington, where poor maintenance led to the death of the plants that were added to the building. And here we have a picture of a green-ringed parakeet. Introduced and invasive species are a really big issue in urban environments. And so the fact that people who are in charge of maintaining these buildings aren't able to monitor what biodiversity they're actually supporting is an issue at the moment. The current methods that are used for monitoring biodiversity you might recognise from maybe geography class at school. These are traditional biodiversity surveys. This is our ecologist, which we collaborated with, doing some urban ecology. This is in Kensington. And so these kind of skills aren't really, people who work in the built environment don't typically have these ecological survey skills. So we were trying to develop a new way to make it easier for people who retrofit their buildings with biodiversity structures to be able to understand how their features are performing and adapt them in an adaptive management cycle. So we looked at what species we have in the urban environment and what new technologies we could work with. And the urban environment has typically harbours species that can be quite noisy. So that's birds, we have the flight of insects, and also bats that call above our hearing range in the ultrasonic range. These are all species that exist in the urban environment, and measuring the sound that they make could possibly give us a way of understanding what biodiversity we have in the urban environment. So here at the bottom we see a spectrogram, and this is typically the way you can visually look at images of sound through a fast Fourier transform. So we wanted to develop a way of taking the sounds that were made by these species to get a measure of biodiversity. So what we did, we tried to answer two main questions. First of all, can urban biophony, that's all the sound associated with the biotic environment, can this be used as an index of urban biodiversity? These questions have been asked in different environments, in tropical rainforests, in temperate woodlands, even in the marine environment. But this question has never been tackled in the urban environment, probably because of the high levels of anthropogenic noise that we need to deal with. And also, we wanted to look at what is it about a local site, what is it about your green infrastructure feature, and the urban environment around it, which affects the correlation between urban biophony and urban diversity. So we used the grant to purchase a number of these high-tech pieces of recording equipment that are passive. You can leave them out for about a week at a time, and they passively record all the sound made in the environment that's in the frequency range that we can hear as humans, and also in the frequency range above where we can hear, so picking up species like bats as well as birds and insects. We've deployed these across the city, trying to get a mixture of different kinds of environments, often hidden because we were putting them in public spaces, so trying to keep them out of people's view, and mounting the microphones in kind of open spaces so we could get a really good recording of the acoustic environment. We were also lucky enough to collaborate with the London Diocese, who were running an ecological survey project across London at the same time. They were trying to get an idea about what biodiversity their churchyards were supporting. So this acted as our ground truthing information, where we could compare our urban biophony with our urban biodiversity. And these are our field sites spread across London to try and get a good spread of different urban environments. So hopefully this will work. This is just a few examples of the kind of sounds that we recorded over the summer. So this is these are spectrograms of kind of common sounds that we were finding. This is a bird call in the early morning. A lot of activity going on in the spectrogram. It's quite a complex sound. This is a very central environment. This is in Kensington, and you can see that you have some birdsong going on here, but you also have a low rumble of plane going overhead. Oh, where's it gone? See a low hum right at the bottom of the spectrogram, sort of almost disguising the fact that you have a bird calling there. And then we have a couple of issues with the fact that we collaborated with the London Diocese, so most of our sites were on churchyards. So this is a recording from a Sunday morning. Try and sort through some of those things. Okay, so really we've only managed to get a real snapshot of our information at the moment because we collected almost more than we really realised we would, an enormous amount of acoustic data, giving us a really great idea of what the urban soundscape looks like across London. And this is an initial method that we have used to create a sort of index of diversity from our acoustic recordings. This is one that has been developed in a temperate woodland, so we'll need a bit of adjusting. But you can see in the centre of the city, we're actually getting quite high levels of diversity in comparison to the sites more on the outskirts of the city, which wasn't necessarily what we expected. So we want to look into what it is about those sites and the surrounding landscape, which means that we're getting quite high levels of diversity there. We're also starting to look at the temporal patterns in our data, so looking at where we're getting peaks in diversity, which should hopefully help us choose what times of day it would be useful for someone to use this kind of method to get an idea about what their biodiversity is like on their site. And so what's next? So we've really only sort of scratched the surface of answering our questions at the moment. The next year will really be spent looking in detail at what our urban soundscape data looks like. And next summer, we'll be going out into the field again with our detectors to collect additional data focused on environments that maybe we find are a bit more interesting, or trying to focus on species that we think could be a particular indicator of biodiversity. And then summer 2015, we'll be taking our method and testing them with actual end users, so the kind of people that constructed this green wall, and seeing how our method works with these kind of features. So if you have any questions, just feel free to contact me. Thanks.
We do have time for a couple of questions.
Thank you. Pamela Harling, Sustainable Haringey. I'm sorry you didn't come to Haringey. Can you really pick up insect noises against the background hum?
In the much quieter environments, you can. But yeah, we had a couple of sites. We had a couple of quite rural sites, and we picked up insect noises there. But then the more urban sites, as you would expect, you would get the really noisy birds and bats, but the insects were completely drowned out. So that's something that we'll definitely think about when adapting this for the urban environment, is whether insects are actually a suitable species to be looking at.
Two questions down here.
Are you, Alison, very nice presentation by the way,
Thanks.
discovering sort of corridor effects in cities, just as one has in the countryside, where hedgerows are important for sustaining the balance of species in the countryside. Interesting that you show that large degree of biodiversity in the centre. Maybe it's to do with the royal parks. But then you looked at New York and showed how the old rail systems have been developed to create green walkways.
Yeah, the sort of the connectivity of our sites to other green spaces in the urban landscape is something. It's some spatial analysis that I'd like to do on the information. Is whether how connected our sites are to the green network, if that is affecting what the biodiversity is like in those sites. And another part of the project will be sort of like helping the pre-planning process of these kind of green infrastructure features to take into account how connected people's buildings are to the rest of the green network.
So I have a question. Hi, I'm Lily Song. I'm a provost fellow with STEEP. My question is about this counterintuitive finding where there's greater audio, acoustic diversity in the center city as opposed to the outlying region. Do you have any hunches about why that might be? Is it certain kind of planning or integration of green spaces in these center city areas, or sort of curious what your thoughts are on that?
This is only from really a hunch from knowing the field sites that we used, but the ones where we got really high diversity are actually quite close to green spaces that are maintained for biodiversity, and that's possibly because we have less green spaces in the cities, so the ones we have are kind of better managed, whereas in the rural sites, the green spaces are more abundant, so not necessarily managed for biodiversity. That is kind of my hunch about with those particular sites that are high. For example, one was in Roehampton, which was right next to Putney Heath, which is quite a wild area. So even though Putney is a suburban area with a massive green space there, maybe it's sort of biased the result a little bit, whereas the sites down towards the south of the city in Croydon are further out of the city, but I'm not sure if the green spaces that they were close to were sort of managed for biodiversity. They were more sort of like parks with flat green grass and one or two trees, but not really managed for biodiversity in that way. I think that might be why.
Okay. Thank you very much.